I'm going to show you how to paint a watercolour without using any traditional paintbrushes. Let's get started. I've used an HB pencil on 300g paper, and it's a cold press paper. I'm using a scourer now. I'm going to do some masking of the light flowers, the white flowers, and the highlights on the vase. I'm just tearing this scourer now, so I've got a nice sort of ragged edge. You don't want to cut them because you'll get a straight edge. I'm using my toothbrush and Jackson's masking fluid, and I've actually poured out a little bit of the blue masking fluid from my bottle from Jackson's Art Supplies into my lid, and I've also put some paper there, so when I tap the masking fluid and then tap it onto the painting, you get rid of some of the blobs. So I'm actually tapping this onto the white lilac flowers, but also onto the pink and blue, just where you can see the light areas. That'll be on the top outside edge. I'm also using an old toothbrush to spatter some of the masking fluid, but I have to say I didn't really get on well with that. I prefer using my paintbrush that's got a little bit of liquid soap on it, so to protect the brush, and then spatter that. But obviously I'm not using brushes here. I'm using my plastic card now to create highlights onto the surface of the vase, and you can see I swiped it there a little bit on the bottom right hand side, but also printed sort of lines as well. It's quite nice. As you can see, I'm using my mapping pen here at the top of the vase to create a highlight on the rim of the vase there. So you can put as much lights and highlights as you want, but if you don't want to use masking fluid, you can do this with white gouache afterwards, or as I do later, some white pastels. So you've got some choices there. So as you can see with the mapping pen, or you can use your twig as well, I'm just putting some really small little highlights onto the vase there and onto the bottom of the vase where you can see some really light areas there. And I'm going to let this dry naturally. I'm not going to use my hairdryer. And also I just thought it'd be quite nice to do, just to draw around some of the edges of the flowers of the lilacs here, just to create a little bit of detail and definition, especially because I'm not using brushes. So the masking fluid has dried naturally, and I'm using some paper towel sort of torn, so you get a nice sort of ragged edge, not a straight edge, when I'm going to be spattering with my toothbrush. I'm just protecting the vase and all of the sort of background areas, and the white flowers have actually been masked out, but I'm just masking out some of the pink flowers as well. So you can use these later as well when you want to mask out or protect the vase and the blue flowers when you're spattering on the pink. So I'm going to mix up a little bit of the ultramarine now using my size 6 brush with lots of water in there as well. And I'm using a tiny bit, well, I'm starting off with the magenta there and going a little bit more into the blue, but you've basically got just a tiny bit of pink there. So it's a blue violet and ultramarine on its own. And I'm just now spritzing water, clean water, onto the surface there, also around the background as well, but concentrating on the blue lilacs, holding down my paper there. And I didn't want the kitchen towel to get wet either. So I'm going to start off with a toothbrush. I'm not a great lover of spattering with toothbrush. I much rather do it with a brush, but you may get on with them better. I'm just using the ultramarine by itself, and then the ultramarine with a touch of pink there. It's actually looking quite pretty. I quite like that effect there, and you'll find because I spritzed as well, you're going to get some dry areas. I'm using my paper towel just to kind of get some of the shape of the lilacs back, but also leaving a little bit of that spatter in the background, so it's quite a nice combination. It's lovely and loose. What I'm using now is the scourer with some fresh ultramarine there, and painting this or pressing this quite gently onto the damp surface, sort of wet into wet or damp into damp. And the blue, the ultramarine blue, is slightly creamier, just to make a little bit of stronger, darker tonal values there. I must say I'm delighted with the texture that the scourer is making. It's quite sort of random, and it really is effective for creating the look of the lilacs. I've actually cut up a bit of a birthday card, so it's actually card, it's not a plastic card, it's paper card, quite thick, and I'm applying some of the permanent yellow and the Glacier turquoise colour, and it's straight from the tube, these pans that I've got here. I've squeezed out fresh colour. It's on there very neat, so I'm just giving it a little spritz to sort of blend the colours, but also to sort of soften it and let it all run down to keep it quite abstract and loose as well. You may want to actually spritz the vase first and then apply the paint. You can also try to mix the paint in your palette as well, so you get a light green. You're painting on a light green, so there's lots of different ways around this. I just went straight in with the card, but I quite like this effect now because it's creating some harmony and colour at the bottom of the painting, so it's quite nice. So I'm using the plastic card now. I've mixed the colours in the palette using a little bit of the Quinacridone gold and a touch of the ultramarine, sort of blue and yellows, and this is really creamy Quinacridone gold with a touch of the ultramarine to paint in some of the stems, sort of damp into damp, and you can see it bleeding slightly, but I quite like the look of that. It almost looks like they're in water in the vase as well. So I'm adding a little bit more blue here with the Quinacridone gold, really creamy. The vase has been protected by the masking fluid, so don't panic. And I'm just painting this and marking it really, or printing it damp into damp in these sort of abstract marks here. So even though I've got my drawing there, I'm kind of just painting from instincts, seeing what I can get from this card. A lot of you have sort of followed along with my abstract buildings and seascapes with the card. So this is not unlike that technique here. I'm just going to use my spritzer bottle to soften some of the paint and also to mix it and create some abstracty effects. And I really like what's happening there. I almost just want to leave it like that. It looks so beautiful, and you may want to do that as well. I will take it a bit further because I like to push the boundaries to see what I can do. So I've mixed up a little bit more of the ultramarine with a tiny touch of the pink, and I'm going to use the scourer again, and this time I'm going to paint this, sort of tap it into it, the surface there, wet into wet, and that's the blue lilac that's actually on the table surface there. I'm making thicker, mixing up thicker ultramarine here and tapping in some slightly darker shades. It's so effective how that works there. It's lovely and soft. I'm mixing up some creamier ultramarine with a tiny touch of the pink there, and I'm going to sponge in now the natural sponge, but you can carry on using your scourer, but this creamier colour, which will be darker, damp into damp, just in the sort of slightly darker shaded areas of these lilacs here, but you'll still get some nice soft edges, but there might be some dry bits here and there. That'll be okay as well, some crisp dry bits there, but that looks very effective. I'm actually mixing up a bit of cerulean here because I can see some cooler colours in those blue lilacs. So I'm just sponging in a little bit of that cerulean colour just to give them a bit of balance there, because if you look closely there is a sort of a more cerulean shade there. So I've painted that in. Now I've been a bit naughty because I didn't wait for my paint to dry there. I've just put the kitchen towel over the top, but I would advise you to let it dry. And as you can see, I've got very watery pink there, and I've spritzed the surface of the paper so it is wet, but there are dry patches, so I'm not using a brush there, and I'm using the toothbrush to spatter some of this pink. You can see the blues coming off on the paper towel there, and it probably could create a little bit of texture. We'll have to have a look, but it's quite nice here the way the spattering has gone on there, and I'm using the scourer now to create some textures, but it's a bit blobby. This happens, so I've just used my spritzer bottle to spray that area and try again, and I felt it needed to be a little bit wetter in that area and maybe the paint slightly creamier to get that effect. And I'm just moving the paper towel out of the way just to come further down and give these lilacs a little bit of a spritz there, and again tap on gently the pink paint there, and it starts to come to life. Look at that, it looks so pretty and the vase looks gorgeous. I'm just preparing some darker shades there with the pink with a touch of the blue, but just lifting off with my paper towel some of the areas where the pink went onto the leaves area there, and it's coming off quite nicely. Even if it leaves a stain, it creates this lovely soft harmonious colours here and there. So this is the darker pink, the pink with a touch of blue, and I'm just sponging this gently on to the surface of the paper. It's actually picked up a little bit more blue than I anticipated there on the left and in the middle, but it actually looks quite effective. This is creamy pink with a tiny touch of ultramarine to make it darker. You can see there's hardly any liquid there, and I'm using my sponge and pressing very gently, damp into damp, to paint some of these darker shades. I must say I like these dark pinks here. It really brings the lilacs here to life in the foreground. Just tapping away there. Some areas are dry, so the paint looks darker because it's got darker edges. It doesn't dilute onto the surface there. Now, there's a bit of a risk here, though. Some of you that love Brusho, and I do, I'm actually using Alizarin Crimson. I'm tapping. I'm being very careful here. I'm just tapping a little bit on there, but even that went a long way. I'm using the spritzer bottle to kind of get it diluted a little bit, and it's run a little bit too much there, so I'm just tapping it with my paper towel just to lift off some of the paint. I'm using a little bit of Ost blue. You can use violet as well onto the wet blue lilacs, and yeah, this is the violet here, so I've used a mixture of both those colours, and I'm going to let my painting dry. So the painting has dried now, and I'm really pleased with it, and I just think to myself, now it just needs a little bit of texture here and there. So I'm mixing up some darks now for the blue violet lilacs, and I'm using ultramarine with a touch of pink and just making one slightly more blue than the other. I'm using the natural sponge now to apply this paint wet on dry. I find the natural sponge creates better marks wet on dry. The scourer I find works better wet on wet or damp into damp. Sometimes no paint doesn't seem to want to come off it wet on dry onto the paper, but as you can see there, that colour really stands out, and I'm actually almost shaping these lilacs with the by printing with the sponge there. It's quite effective. Just less is more. You want to keep plenty of light as well. Remember, this is the sort of darks and detail area here. So I'm mixing up some darker pink here with my size 6 brush. That's the magenta with a touch of ultramarine. I'm still using the natural sponge. This is wet on dry, and I'm very gently tapping this darker shade where I can see the darks in the photograph. So it's quite effective, and I'm just really tapping ever so gently these darker shades on here. Remember, less is more. So I thought I'd use the toothbrush again. Remember, no paintbrushes here, to create some textures. This is quite a watery down ultramarine with a touch of pink. So what I'm doing here is I'm mixing up a really dark creamy colour here with the pink, with the ultramarine, and a tiny touch of the Quinacridone gold, just to make it sort of more neutral. And I'm tapping on very gently with my little scourer, and this is kind of damp into damp. And I do love that dark colour. It's perfect. So that's the magenta with ultramarine with a tiny smidge of Quinacridone gold, or you can use yellow. And I'm just sort of painting in or printing in these darks here, and it really does pop out and shape those pink lilacs there. So I thought it'd be quite nice to do the same with the blue lilacs. So I mixed up a little bit of ultramarine with a tiny touch of the pink, quite creamy and dark, and using the scourer, damp into damp, just in those little dark areas, really to create some depth in these gorgeous lilacs here. And remember, less is more. It can feel sometimes that it looks good and you kind of want to do a bit more to it. When you think to yourself your painting looks good, stop. I always find that, just stop then, because it looks good. Don't try to embellish on that, because I always find sometimes it's just a fine line, and you just too much, and you can almost lose all your hard work. As you can see, I'm actually mixing with my plastic card that fits neatly into my little half pans there. So I'm using some ultramarine. I've dipped it into the dark pink colour. So that was the ultramarine, the magenta, and the Quinacridone gold. So it's just more of a dark bluey green here, printing onto the base or the bottom of the vase here, trying to get that sort of round shape, the sort of the curve there. So I'm mixing up here a little bit of the yellow with that dark pink colour, so it's quite a muddy sort of green. I've had a little bit more ultramarine, and I'm going to use the plastic card here to print some of the stems, some of the dark stems there in the vase, and this is wet on dry. So I'm being very bold with my darks here, and the paint is quite creamy, and I'm almost drawing with the card there, sort of moving the paint along. You don't want the paint too thick and creamy that it doesn't move, and I'm going to be spraying a little bit this later, so you want that to move as well. So you want a little bit of liquid. As you can see there, as I scrape with the card, you can see the paint moving, so it gives you an idea of what the liquid of the paint is like, the thickness. And I'm just putting a little bit more dark now underneath the vase there, and I've also made some marks at the base of the vase, at the back as well, and around the side here, all using this plastic card, you know, varying the colours well, using blues. I'm actually painting the stem of the lilac there as well, but I'm using blues, and then blue on its own, dark greens, yellow greens, and as you can see now, I'm spritzing, tilting, letting everything run down, letting the colours sort of blend, and letting all that sort of shadow colour underneath the vase run down as well. It's beautiful. And I'm just actually now printing some of the dark blue wet on dry onto the lilac on the table, and actually printing in some of the dark just on the left hand side of the top of the vase there. So I've allowed my painting to thoroughly dry, and I'm going to remove the masking fluid with the paper towel. I find this is so effective. I do like to use framing tape as well. It's less messy doing that, but it does come off nicely with the paper towel. So as you can see, lots of highlights on the vase, and you can see now the white lilac flowers as well coming through. So my masking fluid has been removed, and I'm just mixing up a very sort of dark green. I want to create some darks on that vase again, because obviously when I sprayed it, I lost a little bit of the definition there. So I'm using a plastic card again to print wet on dry, the stems and also the darks at the base of the vase as well. So I was almost trying to draw with the card, so I thought I'll get my mapping pen out. You can use your twig, and I just thought I'd make a little puddle of dark. That's the ultramarine with a little bit of the quinacridone gold, touch of pink, and I just thought I'd draw in some of the outlines of the leaves here, just to get a little bit of definition. You know, because obviously I've got a lot of texture and marks and things like that, but I just needed some sort of structure to bring especially the vase and the leaves together. Very tricky to paint with sponges and things, so I really enjoy doing this actually. A mapping pen is like a calligraphy pen. You can use that also as well, and but a twig sharpened and a pencil sharpener works really well. I'll also use a bamboo pen later, which I've had for years, that I use when I'm painting or drawing with pen and wash. I really enjoy trying out different sort of materials, traditional and non-traditional. So it's quite nice here. I'm just dipping my pen in and drawing on some of these leaves here. You do have to keep going back and dipping in your pen, and you need a puddle as well, so you can really sort of dip that pen in, or if you're using a twig, really sort of let that twig sort of get lots and lots of paint on there. And I'm going to let my painting dry again, and what I'm doing here is I'm just using a sponge and a paper towel just to try to lift off some highlights or soft lights onto the surface of the vase to create that look of a transparency of the glass there. And I'm going to let my painting dry. So my painting has dried again. I'm using my sponge and some white gouache. You can use white acrylic or even white watercolour. It can be a little bit more transparent, the watercolour, so you may need to sort of let it dry and then work over the top again. But I'm just tapping in. I tapped in, as you saw, some sponging there with a natural sponge, but also with the scour as well, trying out different textures. I have to say I love the texture of the scour. It's very natural looking. And it's really sort of bringing this painting together towards the end here, just tapping in some lights with the white gouache, as you can see I've got on the surface there of my board. And I'm just sort of sweeping a little bit of the white gouache onto the surface of the vase to create some highlights. And I'm just using a clean damp sponge there just to soften that highlight. I've mixed up ultramarine with some quinacridone gold here, and even a little bit of turquoise with some pink. It's a very, very dark colour. I'm actually printing now some of the sides of the vase, this very dark creamy colour, with the birthday card, that's the paper card, to get these sort of round effects. It's very difficult to get that with the plastic card because it doesn't bend, and I found that quite effective actually for printing these rounder, curvier marks. Just trying to vary the directions. They're not all sort of going into the vase. These stems all look the same angle. Just trying to vary it a little bit. I'm using my spritzer bottle now as well, just to soften a little bit these stems so they look like they're inside the vase. I'm just sort of drawing on a watery ultramarine just to create some lines, marks and textures to add a bit more detail, so it's not just these sort of sponged lilacs and spattered lilacs. You've got a few more lines and marks in between. Just adds a little bit, an element of realism in there, and this is wet on dry. So I've painted lots of little darks around the flowers, and I thought I'd put a little bit of limey green. That's the yellow. I'm using the Glacier Turquoise, but you could use the Cerulean again. So it's plenty of paint there, nice big puddle, and I'm just sort of drawing inside some of the white flowers there. For it's like a limey green, sort of fresh spring green colour there. And I'm going to let my painting dry. So to finish off my painting, I have dried it and I'm using my soft pastels. They're like chalks, a little bit better quality. And I'm using the white just to paint on or draw on some of the highlights here and there that I may have lost. And it's quite a nice idea. You can use white gouache to do this also, but it's quite nice to use a different medium, especially because I'm challenging myself not to use any brushes. So here is the finished painting and I'm really pleased with it. If you have any questions about this tutorial, please put them in the comments section below. And if you'd like to see more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to my channel where you'll get updates of my latest tutorials. And if you'd like to learn more about watercolor painting and get access to my weekly exclusive watercolor tutorials, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Details about the membership can be found in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.